Teachers who have taught future murderers and major criminals, what were they like when they were under your tutelage? I've posted this before, but when I first started working as the English teacher at a public elementary school in Tokyo, one of the teachers was telling me about how the class's pet dwarf hamster Totoro had gotten out of his cage and accidentally been stepped on. He was a little guy, so it wasn't exactly a bloody scene, but nobody knew who did it, and all the kids were sad. A few weeks later, one of the other class's pet guinea pig got out of his cage and was stepped on as well. Like, stomped flat. Very messy, and someone had clearly used some tissues to clean off their shoes before leaving the room. All of the students wear the same kind of in-school slippers, so it's not like we could go CSI on the situation and figure it out by shoe print. But one of the other teachers noticed that one girl in her class, a 5th grader, had some suspicious reddish smears on the edges of one of her shoes. The girl was called to the office, and parents were called. The next day, the parents come in and explain to the principal that they are moving their daughter to a new school. Basically, she's not your problem anymore, so don't bother trying to call in child counselors or anything. So rather than make a big deal out of it all, which would have been a headache for everyone, the school let it all slide because the girl was gone. A few years later, there was a local news story about a junior high girl who'd assaulted another student. It sounded like she pushed the other girl down some stairs and then kicked her. They didn't publish names because she's a minor, but word traveled down the grapevine pretty quickly that it was our former student. I'm not sure what happened to her after that. While I was a student teacher, I taught a young man who planned a school shooting for the night of his prom. He had weapons and apparently fully intended to harm his classmates, but was arrested after he made some alarming comments. He seemed like a nice kid, but very strange and withdrawn. He used to try to make jokes and witty comments, but was just awkward and got shut down a lot. Honestly, he was exactly what you imagine a kid who has been bullied, but still tries to make friends would be like. I suspect he was on the spectrum as well, but never diagnosed. I feel bad for him despite the terrible things he planned to do. His classmates ended up raising a sizable amount of money and donating it to mental health charities, and they did eventually have their prom just before the end of the school year. The student served about 6 months in jail and was given a few years of probation. One of my former students murdered 2 people, apparently on a drug deal gone wrong. He is now serving life in prison. I had him in 1st grade. Sweet kid, highly intelligent. Seriously, he was reading on a 3rd grade level, despite the fact that he came in late every day. Not just 10 or 15 minutes late, usually he would come in around 10 o'clock. Dad was not in the picture, in prison for gang activity, and mom was unconcerned about his education. I tried everything I could to impress on her just how intelligent her son was, and how he had a very bright future, but that he needed to be in school. She honestly didn't seem to care. He later dropped out when he was in high school, joined a gang, and things snowballed. Such a goddamn waste. I taught 3 students that together went on to commit at least one locally high profile murder, and probably others, and will likely die in prison as a result of them. 2 of them are brothers, Adam and Brian. It became apparent pretty early on that their house had drug issues, and there was some serious neglect going on. Physical abuse too, from little things the boys let slip. They rarely had lunches, never had winter coats, and their shoes regularly were being glued or duct taped together. They'd talk about fights at their house, drug use, drunk parents, all sorts of things. We reported everything the entire year they were in my classroom, trying to get some intervention. They were actually from a fairly large family, 6 or 7 kids, but it never turned into anything. As students, they were entitled and did things like cutting in lines or taking someone else's candy, and rowdy, but not entirely stupid. I think the total lack of discipline at home, never having consequences for not doing homework, was a huge contributing factor to how they ended up. Adam was not the brightest bulb. He was a follower, for sure, and a little bit of a bully. He'd posture to show off, but if you pressed him, he'd back down. Never had problems with him in the classroom after the first week, just in the halls, or recess, or at the bus stops. Acted tough, but at least when I knew him, it was a fairly unconvincing act. Brian was always kind when neither of the other two co-murderers were around. A really quiet kid, or thinker. But he stuck by his brother like glue. I guess they didn't have much else going for them, nobody else to watch their backs, so they were 100% together in pretty much everything. I really hoped Brian'd end up in a better place. He was brighter, kinder, and patient. Liked to read. I had hope with him. I thought, if any of them have a chance, it's him. And if it weren't for the third kid they fell in with, Carl, he probably would have. Cole was a problem kid, had a file thicker than a dictionary. I saw him stab a kid, for no reason, and then say it was because he wanted to see what happened. We had to remove all scissors from our classroom because he liked to cut things. He threw a desk once. Mid-story time, no apparent trigger. Just got up, threw it at a girl, and then laughed when she started crying. He was a nightmare on the bus, on the playground, and so on. He had a recess duty assigned to keep an eye on him, because whether he directly did it or not, kids got hurt when he was around. He talked about killing animals, going hunting, and about doing things like taking people into the woods, getting them really lost, and then leaving them to die. He was a creep. He liked to pick on little girls. Not the ones in his grade, but ones 4, 5 years younger. He'd corner them and bully them to tears, sometimes physically snatching at their dresses or pulling their hair. He was awful and constantly in and out of the principal's office. Adam worshipped Carl, or followed him around like it, anyway, and Brian, well, he stuck with his brother. It was so sad to see happening. They all lived in the same area and knew one another outside of school, and I always got the impression that Brian was afraid of Carl. I know some of the other teachers in the building were. Hell, I'll even admit I was too. I was on constant guard with him in class. He even in elementary school was fully capable of doing some serious permanent harm, and we all knew it. Together, while still in high school, they abducted and killed a classmate. Had an 8th grader who was a jerk. Wouldn't listen, constantly disrupted the class, and put in little to no effort. Was a bully to the other students. Unfortunately, our admin at the time was a pushover, so nothing ever happened when we would refer him or anyone else. One day he came back from the office and I overheard him telling a classmate when asked what happened that the principal gave him some candy and sent him back to class. Cut to 6 years later, see his face on the news being arrested for a gang murder. Not the least bit surprised. I taught at an alternative school for a year. I have several students who later ended up in jail for everything from robbery to murder. Most of them weren't surprising. These were kids who clearly had no family structure or discipline at home. And almost all of them were affiliated with gangs somehow. We even had middle school kids jumped into gangs at the school. But alternative schools get almost no support from anyone but the police. It's basically a step away from jail. The one who committed murder killed a pizza delivery driver over a drug deal. He was actually somewhat surprising, because he was far from the worst kid I dealt with. He was a skinny, nerdy looking kid with braces, but he was hanging out with all the hard gang members too. I dunno, maybe he felt like he had to prove himself. I volunteered a couple of times at an alternative school. One of my pastors was the principal there, so our church youth group would help out from time to time. I was in a 4th grade classroom and was tasked with helping a boy learn to read. It was basic stuff, cat, dog, run, etc. He had a task to spell cat and dog and couldn't or wouldn't try to see the difference. He said he'd never need to know how to read, so why should he? I told him I'd draw some pictures of what the words were next to the words, so he could try to memorize them. He said something along the lines of, "If you try to make me do this, I'll slit your throat and F your corpse." Note, was a 275-pound dude. I told the teacher, who told me not to worry, that they check him daily to make sure he's not carrying a knife, since he's had a few incidents. Not sure what happened to that kid, nothing good. She'd also previously told me he wasn't allowed pencils or pens, and was only allowed to write with crayons due to his violent outbursts. If he's still alive, he'd be around 25 now. Coincidentally, I mean that literally, I'm not being glib, I didn't end up volunteering there again. I did drive past there once, and saw a bunch of kids beating the crap out of one kid outside. I called 911, and was thanked for the report, and that police were already on site.